My name is Tiffany, and my life has unexpectedly turned into an exhilarating journey. It all began during my time as a perfume sales manager at a luxurious department store. One day, a tall, handsome man entered the store, looking quite anxious as he toyed with his phone while heading to the counter. "Hi," he uttered nervously. "I need help picking out a perfume for my mom." His sincere concern for his mother's happiness was charming. "I'll make sure we find the perfect scent," I assured him, and we started exploring some of the popular fragrances. His name was Jeffrey, a 32-year-old who worked for his family's construction business and lived close by. We hit it off quickly, chatting effortlessly. I was drawn to his warm brown eyes and timid smile. After nearly an hour, we chose a sophisticated floral perfume. As I packaged the perfume, Jeffrey hesitated before asking, "Tiffany, would you like to go for coffee sometime?" My heart fluttered. "I'd love to," I replied, managing to keep my voice calm. That coffee date blossomed into dinner and more outings together. Jeffrey was sweet and thoughtful and always made me laugh. We enjoyed similar pastimes like watching movies, hiking, and dining out. Before long, we were a couple, and everything seemed perfect until I met his mother, Sandra. Jeffrey had hinted that his mother was somewhat overbearing, but I was unprepared for her formidable presence. We met at an upscale restaurant where Sandra sat at the head of the table, eyeing me critically as we approached. Dressed impeccably with her hair in a tight bun, she greeted me coldly and barely acknowledged my handshake. "So, you're the girl Jeffrey's dating," she remarked icily. As dinner progressed, Sandra quizzed me sharply. "Where did you say you work, Tiffany?" She interrupted as I began to answer. "A perfume sales manager at retail? How quaint," she scoffed, and then inquired about my family. When I mentioned my parents were teachers, she remarked, "Well, I suppose someone has to do it," continuing to make snide remarks throughout the evening. Jeffrey offered silent support, squeezing my hand, yet said nothing in my defense. After dinner, Sandra pulled me aside. "Listen carefully, Tiffany. I run this family. I decide what's best for my sons. If you want a future with Jeffrey, you'll need to prove your worth," she whispered sharply. Stunned, I couldn't respond. When Jeffrey proposed, I was ecstatic, but that joy was soon overshadowed by Sandra's domination of our wedding plans. She dictated every detail, from the venue to the guest list. I tried to assert my ideas, but was swiftly dismissed. "Those are nice, dear, but let's leave this to the professional," she insisted. Jeffrey, pleading with his eyes, whispered, "Just go along with it, it's easier this way." So, I watched helplessly as my dream wedding morphed into Sandra's grand vision. Despite this, I remained hopeful that things would change once we were married and living independently. The first few months of our marriage were a whirlwind of joy as Jeffrey and I settled into our new apartment, embracing the thrill of creating our own space together. Despite the excitement of setting up our new apartment, Sandra's influence was impossible to ignore. She would often visit unannounced while Jeffrey was at work, ostensibly just to check in. As she critiqued our living room layout, "Oh, dear, is this how you've arranged it? Let me show you a better way." I would clench my teeth and force a smile, trying to see her intrusions as well-intentioned, even though they felt more like encroachments on our privacy. One evening, as Jeffrey and I enjoyed a quiet dinner, my phone broke the tranquility with a call from my boss. He offered me a promotion to senior sales manager, a role I had long aspired to. Thrilled, I shared the news with Jeffrey, who was equally happy for me. The next day, we found ourselves at Sandra's house for dinner. The tension was palpable. As she served what appeared to be a perfect roast, I could barely swallow, the meat tasting like sawdust. "Tiffany," Sandra began, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness, "Jeffrey tells me you've been offered a promotion." "How nice." "Yes, I'm very excited about it," I replied, striving to maintain my composure. Sandra's smile tightened. "Well, dear, I think it's time we discuss your real future. We need someone in sales, and with your experience, you'd be perfect." I took a deep breath. "Sandra, I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy in my current job. I don't want to leave it." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Sandra's eyes narrowed.
"I see.
"So, you don't consider yourself part of this family then?" Feeling my temper rise, I responded, with all due respect, Sandra, you don't get to decide what's best for my marriage or career. Sandra stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. I think you need to reconsider your priorities, young lady. Jeffrey, talk some sense into your wife. With that, she stormed out. I turned to Jeffrey, expecting his support, but instead, he looked conflicted. Tiffany, maybe we should think about this. Mom knows what she's doing. The drive home was silent, heavy with unspoken words and growing resentment. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that my struggle wasn't just with Sandra, it was with the entire family dynamic I had married into. Tension thickened with each passing day. One Sunday, at a family barbecue at Sandra's, I was in the kitchen preparing salads when I overheard Sandra on the patio. It's such a shame, she announced loudly. I remember Brian's ex-wife. She was just as ungrateful as Tiffany. But I showed her the door, kicked her out of this family myself. My cheeks burned. Brian, Jeffrey's older brother, looked uncomfortable. Mom, please, he muttered, but Sandra pressed on. I'm just saying, a woman should know her place. Isn't that right, Frank? Jeffrey's father merely grunted, seldom opposing his wife. I couldn't bear it any longer. Marching out to the patio, salad bowl in hand, I confronted her. Sandra, if you have something to say to me, why don't you say it to my face? The backyard fell silent. Sandra's eyes narrowed.
Fine.
You want to know what I think? I think you're not good enough for this family. You're stubborn, you're disrespectful, and you're pulling Jeffrey away from his responsibilities. Feeling as though I had been slapped, I retorted, responsibilities? You mean being your puppet? Jeffrey pleaded, Tiffany, please, let's not do this here. I spun around to face him. And you, when are you going to stand up to her? When are you going to be a husband instead of a mama's boy? The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Jeffrey's face crumpled, and Sandra looked triumphant. You see, she crowed, this is who you are. A spiteful, ungrateful girl who doesn't appreciate what she has. Tears welled up in my eyes. Without another word, I dashed into the house, grabbed my purse and keys, and drove away. The weeks following the barbecue incident were tense, as Jeffrey and I barely spoke, tiptoeing around each other in our own home. I immersed myself in work, often staying late at the office just to evade the oppressive quiet of our home. One evening, upon returning, I found Jeffrey waiting for me at the kitchen table, a grave look on his face.
We need to talk, he began.
Mom called today. She wants us to come over for her birthday dinner next week. My stomach knotted at the thought. Jeffrey, I don't think that's a good idea, I said. Please, he implored. It would mean a lot to me. Maybe it's a chance to start over. Despite my urge to decline, to stop accommodating a woman who had no regard for me, the hopeful look in Jeffrey's eyes gave me pause. Fine, I conceded, but this is the last chance, Jeffrey. I mean it. The evening of Sandra's birthday arrived, and I stood at her door, my smile forced as we entered. Sandra greeted us with her customary superficial warmth. Tiffany, dear, she cooed, air-kissing my cheek. So glad you could make it. I was worried you might be too busy with your little job. I clenched my jaw, reminding myself to keep my composure. The dinner progressed with strained smiles and thinly veiled barbs. Sandra dominated the conversations, her sons and husband merely nodding in agreement. As the evening dragged on, Sandra decided it was time for the cake. Tiffany, be a dear and bring out the cake. And don't forget the candles, she instructed. In the kitchen, I was thankful for a moment's respite. I carefully placed the candles on the cake, counting under my breath to ensure I had the right number. Back in the dining room, I presented the cake to Sandra. She scrutinized the candles, her voice sickly sweet. Tiffany, there's one extra candle here. Can you even do a simple task correctly? Or perhaps you're trying to insinuate something about my age. No, of course not, I began, but Sandra cut me off. Enough, she snapped, starting to remove the candles. Since you've ruined the design, you might as well see the mess you've made. Come closer, dear. Hesitantly, I leaned in, only to feel a hand thrust against the back of my head. Before I could react, my face was shoved into the cake. I struggled, gasping for air as frosting clogged my nose and mouth. After what seemed an eternity, Sandra released me. I stood up, coughing and wiping the cake from my eyes. The room fell silent except for Sandra's cruel laughter. Oh dear, looks like someone's made a mess of themselves. Around me, guests awkwardly avoided eye contact, some emitting nervous chuckles. Jeffrey stared at the floor, his face flushed with embarrassment. Without a word, I fled to the bathroom, locking myself in as I scrubbed the cake off my face. I could hear muffled voices outside. A soft knock came at the door. "Tiffany, it's Jeffrey. Are you okay? Do you need help?" I flung the door open, fixing him with a glare. "Help? Now you want to help?" He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "Mom can be a bit eccentric sometimes," he muttered. "We just need to." "Eccentric?" I hissed. "Jeffrey," she assaulted me, "and you just stood there." Without another word, I pushed past him, grabbed my purse, and headed for the door. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from the evening's disaster. The days that followed were a blur of tears, arguments, and sleepless nights. Jeffrey tried to apologize, but his words felt empty. I threw myself even deeper into work, staying late at the office and taking on extra projects, trying to find some solace away from the turmoil at home. Even at work, I couldn't escape Sandra's influence. One afternoon, while I was assisting a customer, I heard a chillingly familiar voice that made my heart sink. "Excuse me, I'd like to speak to a manager," said the voice. I turned to see Sandra standing there, her eyes gleaming maliciously. Oblivious to her identity, my colleague directed her to me. "I'm the senior sales manager. How can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tension. Sandra's lips twisted into a vindictive smile. "I have a complaint about the perfume I purchased here last week. It smells like cheap chemicals, and when I tried to return it, your staff was incredibly rude to me." I knew her claims were false. Our store maintained rigorous quality control and a generous return policy, but before I could defend our practices, she escalated her tirade. "This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to your superior immediately." Alerted by the commotion, my manager approached. Sandra launched into her fabricated tale, depicting me as an incompetent manager who had personally sold her a defective product and then refused assistance. I tried to interject, to clarify the situation, but my manager silenced me with a gesture. "I'm very sorry for your experience, ma'am. Please come with me to my office. We'll sort this out immediately," he said. As they walked away, Sandra shot a triumphant look over her shoulder. I stood there, humiliated and fuming, as whispers circulated among my colleagues. An hour later, my manager summoned me. His expression was grim. "Tiffany, I've received multiple complaints about your performance recently, and after today's incident, I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go." I was stunned. "What?" "But those complaints, they're not real. It's my mother-in-law. She's trying to—" "Tiffany, please," he interrupted. "I understand you're going through some personal issues, but we can't have them affecting your work like this. I'm sorry, but my decision is final." I left the office in a daze, my personal belongings in a small box. Tears blurred my vision as I drove home. When I arrived, Jeffrey was there, his face filled with concern. "Tiffany, what happened?" "Your mother," I spat, "just cost me my job." I recounted the events of the day, my voice rising with each word. "And you want to know the worst part? She used our phone number to file those fake complaints." "Our phone number, Jeffrey, the one you gave her without asking me?" I locked myself in our bedroom, ignoring his pleas from the other side of the door. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was at a crossroads. I couldn't continue living like this, constantly under attack from Sandra and unsupported by my husband. The weeks following my job loss were some of the darkest I'd ever faced. One evening, as I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by job listings and unanswered applications, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I hear you're looking for work. Maybe it's time to reconsider my offer." Sandra, stunned, I wondered how she had gotten my new number, which I had changed specifically to avoid her. As if on cue, Jeffrey walked in. I held up my phone. "Did you give your mother my new number?" His hesitation said it all. Look, maybe we should consider her offer. It's for us, for our future. Faced with this ultimate betrayal, I knew something had to change. This wasn't just about a job or an annoying relative. It was about my self-respect and our future together, both hanging by a thread. I pushed back my chair abruptly, the sound scraping loudly against the floor. Our future, Jeffrey? There won't be a future if this continues. If things don't change soon, I don't know if I can stay in this marriage. The room fell into a stifling silence. Jeffrey appeared stunned, as if unable to grasp the weight of my words. Finally, he whispered, "I'll talk to her, I promise. Just give me some time." I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But I had heard similar promises before. Yet, what other choice did I have? I nodded silently, too disheartened to speak. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Waiting for Jeffrey to confront his mother was no longer an option. I needed to regain some semblance of independence, to remind myself of my strength. I contacted an old colleague who had recently started her own online perfume business. She was understanding of my situation and offered me a job as an online consultant. The pay wasn't much, but it was something, a lifeline amidst the turmoil. But Sandra's influence was far from over. As Christmas approached, so did the annual family gathering, a prospect I dreaded. It would be yet another stage for Sandra to belittle and humiliate me. The night before, Jeffrey and I argued again. He urged me to make more of an effort with his mother, to try and see things from her perspective. Her perspectives? I choked out incredulously. Jeffrey, her perspective is that I'm not good enough for this family, that I should quit my job and become her puppet. How am I supposed to empathize with that? He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. She's set in her ways. If we could just— No, I interrupted firmly. I'm done trying. If you won't stand up for me, for us, then I'll have to do it myself. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. Tomorrow, at the Christmas gathering, I would confront Sandra once and for all. I was tired of being victimized, of letting her dictate my life. Christmas morning arrived with a heavy air of foreboding. We reached Sandra's house to find it bustling with activity. As we entered the living room, I felt Sandra's scrutinizing gaze. The room was already filled with family, Frank, Brian, and various aunts, uncles, and cousins. The afternoon was a blur of forced pleasantries and thinly veiled insults, with Sandra commanding every conversation. She kept steering the topic towards children, glancing at me each time. Finally, during dinner, she addressed me directly with a voice dripping with feigned concern. "Tiffany, dear, I couldn't help but notice you're not drinking. Any special reason?" Feeling my cheeks warm under the scrutiny, I replied, "No, Sandra, I'm just not in the mood for alcohol." Her eyes narrowed. Well, I do hope you're not having difficulties in that area. It's just, well, you're not getting any younger, and with your career struggles, I thought perhaps you'd be focusing on more important matters by now." I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. More important matters? You mean like being a submissive wife who gives up her dreams to please her mother-in-law? Gasps echoed around the table. Sandra's face twisted with rage. "How dare you speak to me like that in my own home?" "No, Sandra," I shot back, standing my ground. "How dare you treat me like this? I am your son's wife, not your punching bag. I've had enough of your manipulation and your cruelty." With those final words, I turned to leave, my resolve as strong as the silence I left behind. I found myself at a turning point as I left Sandra's chaotic Christmas gathering. The incident with the hot tea had been the final straw. In shock and pain, I drove directly to the hospital. The burns were minor, but the emotional scars ran deeper. After the doctors attended to me, I returned to an empty apartment, packed a few essentials, wrote a brief note to Jeffrey about needing some time away, and left. The next day, alone in a nondescript motel room, I reflected on everything while nursing my tender skin. As I mulled over my options, my phone unexpectedly rang. It was Frank, Jeffrey's father, sounding urgent and distressed. "Tiffany, can we talk?" "It's important," he said. Despite my reservations, I agreed, giving him the address of the motel. When Frank arrived, he looked worn and anxious, a stark contrast to the composed man I knew. He wasted no time. "Tiffany, I owe you an explanation about everything, starting with the company. Sandra's manipulations go deeper than you know," he began, his voice shaky. He explained that the business had originally belonged to his parents. When his father fell ill, Sandra deceived him into signing over control, appointing herself as the executive director. I was stunned. "Why haven't you confronted her about this before?" I asked. Tears welled up in Frank's eyes as he admitted his fears and cowardice. He pulled out a folder stuffed with documents, the evidence of Sandra's misdeeds. He spread the papers before me, revealing years of financial discrepancies, exploitation of undocumented workers, and negligent business practices. Sandra had been skirting laws, underpaying her staff, and silencing anyone who dared to challenge her authority. Among the documents was a police report involving Brian's ex-wife, who had nearly exposed Sandra's actions before suffering an accident that left her severely injured. Sandra had coerced Brian into ending his marriage to keep her silent. As I absorbed the information, my resolve hardened. "This is monstrous, Frank. How could she get away with this for so long?" I asked, my voice a mix of anger and disbelief. Frank's breakdown was complete as he confessed his regret for not acting sooner. I was terrified of her, of what she could do. But I can't let fear dictate my actions anymore, not after seeing what she's done to you. Together, we realized that it was not just my battle to fight, but a family ordeal that needed exposure and resolution. With the evidence in hand and a newfound ally in Frank, I prepared to confront Sandra, not just for myself, but for the sake of everyone she had hurt. Our next steps were uncertain, but our path was clear. It was time to bring Sandra's reign to an end. As I watched Frank break down, overwhelmed by a complex swirl of emotions, I felt a powerful mix of anger at Sandra's cruelty and greed, sympathy for Frank and all the exploited workers, and a growing resolve to end this injustice. Together, we decided to seek legal help and approached Brittany, a respected lawyer known for handling corporate fraud cases. Brittany listened intently to our story, and her concern deepened as we spoke. She agreed to represent us, without hesitation. It was a Tuesday afternoon when chaos erupted. My phone was bombarded with notifications, missed calls, text messages, and voicemails, all from Sandra. Bracing myself, I listened to one of the voicemails. Sandra's voice, shrill and furious, echoed through the speaker. "You ungrateful little witch. How dare you turn my husband against me? I'll ruin you for this, do you hear me? I'll destroy you." Her threats were relentless. When I blocked her number, she resorted to using others' phones to continue her tirade. But Sandra didn't stop at phone calls. She launched a full-scale character assassination campaign against me, reaching out to friends, family, and even my former coworkers, spinning a narrative that I had seduced Frank and turned him against her. The deepest cut came when Jeffrey sided with his mother. He confronted me at my new rented apartment, his face contorted with anger and betrayal. "How could you do this to us, to my mother?" he demanded. I attempted to show him the evidence, but he refused to listen. "I don't know who you are anymore," he spat before storming out. Reeling from Jeffrey's rejection, I received an unexpected call from Brian, Jeffrey's older brother. "Tiffany, it's Brian. I heard what's happening, and I want you to know I believe you, and I want to help." His support was a turning point. Brian provided additional evidence of Sandra's misdeeds and agreed to testify in court. He also helped us locate his ex-wife, Emma, whose testimony was crucial. She detailed the incident where Sandra had pushed her down the stairs and the subsequent threats and intimidation she had endured. As the trial date approached, Brittany worked tirelessly. She tracked down several undocumented workers Sandra had exploited. Despite their fear, many agreed to testify, their stories painting a horrifying picture of abuse and exploitation. The trial was intense. Sandra's lawyers fought fiercely, trying to discredit our witnesses and portray Frank and me as conspirators. However, Brittany was exceptional, systematically presenting our evidence and dismantling the defense's arguments. The turning point in the trial came when Brittany presented concrete evidence that Sandra had manipulated Frank's father into signing over the company. The judge listened intently as Brittany argued for the annulment of the will. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge ruled in our favor. The will was annulled, and ownership of the company was returned to Frank. Furthermore, the judge ordered a full investigation into the company's practices and Sandra's finances. As the gavel fell, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Frank sobbed with relief beside me, while Sandra's shrieks of outrage filled the courtroom. The aftermath of the trial brought sweeping changes. Once Frank regained control of the company, Jeffrey, true to his mother's influence, resigned from his position and ceased all communication with his father, unable to forgive what he perceived as a betrayal of his mother. Meanwhile, Frank found unexpected support in Brian. The father and eldest son, both having experienced Sandra's manipulation firsthand, formed a strong partnership, ready to rebuild and steer the company toward a more ethical and prosperous future. The task of restructuring the company was arduous, but Frank and Brian were determined to operate it ethically and efficiently. The legal battles didn't end with Sandra's trial. Frank, feeling liberated from Sandra's toxic influence, swiftly filed for divorce, a process expedited by her tarnished reputation. In the divorce settlement, he magnanimously left her the house they had shared for decades, a generous act given all that had transpired. A court-ordered audit of the company's finances unveiled years of creative accounting and tax evasion. The revelations were severe enough that Sandra was slapped with a massive fine and ordered to pay $820,000 in back taxes. The house, her last remaining asset, had to be sold to settle her debts with the tax authorities. Meanwhile, my marriage to Jeffrey crumbled beyond repair. His steadfast loyalty to his mother, despite the overwhelming evidence of her wrongdoings, was something I could neither comprehend nor accept. We filed for divorce, and signing the papers brought me a bittersweet mix of sadness and relief. As I pondered my future, Frank approached me with an unexpected proposition. "Tiffany," he said, his voice tinged with warmth and gratitude, "I know you've been through hell because of our family, but I want you to know that I still consider you family. We're rebuilding the sales department, and I'd like you to be a part of it. What do you say?" Touched by his offer, and after careful consideration, I accepted. Over the following months, I gradually found my footing in the construction business. Leveraging my experience in luxury retail, I mastered the art of selling everything from lumber to specialized tools. My background proved surprisingly valuable in handling high-end clients and custom projects. One day, during a routine shopping trip, I had an unexpected encounter. As I turned down the cereal aisle, I froze. There, just a few feet away, stood Jeffrey and Sandra. They looked worn and haggard, a stark contrast to their once polished appearance. Sandra's voice, shrill and angry, cut through the air. "You weak-willed idiot," she berated Jeffrey. "Can't you do anything right?" "Asked for the bran flakes, not this sugary garbage." Jeffrey, his shoulders slumped, muttered an apology and reached for another box. A pang of pity struck me as I witnessed how their toxic relationship had not only endured but seemed to have worsened. For a moment, I considered approaching them, but watching their dysfunctional interaction, I realized I had nothing to say. Instead, I quietly turned my cart around and left the store, leaving my shopping unfinished. It was a poignant reminder of the life I had left behind and the new path I had chosen, filled with hope and new beginnings.